the alien princess, laughed at his ancient kinetic rifle, until it pierced Class-5 shielding. The smell came first. Hot copper, scorched insulation, and under it all, the faint sweetness of coolant boiling somewhere it shouldn't be. Osei had learned a long time ago that a ship tells you it's dying before the alarms do. The alarms were just there to make it official, the paperwork after the fact. He was elbow-deep in the number 3 coolant manifold of the Harrow's debt, a hauler so old the manufacturer plate had rusted into unreadable freckles, when the whole vessel shuddered like something had grabbed it by the spine and shaken. Tools clattered off the deck plating. A wrench spun past his ear and he didn't flinch, because flinching wasted half a second, and half a second was sometimes the whole difference between fixing something and burying someone. His hand stayed steady on the crimping tool even as the floor tilted a few degrees under him. Some old instinct from a life he didn't talk about anymore, keeping his shoulders loose and his breathing even. "Talk to me," he said, not to anyone in particular, more to the manifold itself, the way a man might talk to a dog that had just yelped. The reply came from the calm, bolted crooked to the bulkhead, tinny and panicked, the voice of a crewman who had never once in his life had to sound calm about anything. "Osei, we've got a boarding signature. Something's latched onto the hull aft cargo section, cutting through now." Dale wiped his hands on a rag that had been white in some previous geological era and looked at the manifold's blinking amber fault light. Coolant pressure dropping, slow but steady, the kind of leak that wouldn't kill anyone in the next 5 minutes but would absolutely kill everyone in the next 5 hours if left alone. Somewhere outside, a ship full of strangers was cutting a hole into his ship, and inside, a busted line was quietly trying to kill everyone by another method entirely, slower but just as final. 2 different kinds of dying, both his problem at the exact same time. That was, he'd found, more or less the story of his whole life, ever since the Navy had decided it didn't want him anymore. Problems didn't care about your rank. They just showed up, stacked on top of each other, and waited to see if you'd hold. "Copy," he said, already reaching for a spare coupling. "Handle the boarders. I've got the part of this that'll actually still matter if we survive the next 10 minutes. He finished the splice with hands that didn't shake, torqued the fitting down to spec even with the deck still trembling faintly under his boots, and only then did he stand, roll his shoulders until something in his spine popped back into place, and go find out exactly how bad the other kind of dying was shaping up to be. Osei was 38 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades hauling things heavier than himself, and currently wearing a jumpsuit with more patches than original fabric. There was a burn scar shaped vaguely like a comma on his left forearm from a plasma coupling that had gone wrong on a ship 3 captains ago. His knuckles were permanently swollen from a decade of skinning them on bulkheads in 0G. He had the kind of face that people forgot the moment they stopped looking at it, which had served him well in 3 different lives before this one, and would, though he didn't know it yet, serve him very well again before the day was over. He had been a naval engineer once, on a real ship, with real rank and a real future laid out in front of him like a corridor with the lights already on. That life had ended in a court-martial hearing room that smelled like recycled air and old paper, over a decision he still believed was the right one, and would make again given the same 5 seconds to decide in, a call to override a superior officer's order, and vent an engine compartment 2 decks early, killing the fire before it killed 40 sailors, at the cost of a very expensive piece of hardware and a very fragile ego above his pay grade. They'd stripped the rank. They hadn't been able to strip the knowledge, so here he was, a demoted nobody wrenching coolant lines on a bucket of a hauler contracted to the fringes of a trade route nobody powerful cared about, which was exactly how he liked it. Quiet ships, small problems, nobody watching too closely. Nobody on the Harrow's deck knew any of that history. To them, he was just Osei, the mechanic who never raised his voice, who fixed things quietly and complained about the coffee loudly, who kept a battered case under his bunk that everyone assumed held spare parts because that's what he'd told them, and who had exactly zero business being anywhere near what was about to happen to him. He liked it that way. Being underestimated had never once cost him anything he minded losing. He grabbed a tool bag on the way to the cargo section, because whatever was cutting through his aft HFY was not going to be impressed by paperwork, and it wasn't going to wait for him to introduce himself either. The hole in the cargo bay was still glowing at the edges when he got there, a ring of slumped, dripping metal cut clean through, with something far more sophisticated than any tool in his bag. Through it came three shapes, moving with the unhurried confidence of things that had never once in their lives needed to hurry for anyone, and Dale's first genuine thought, professional and detached even now, even with his pulse hammering somewhere behind his ribs, was, that doorway is going to need structural reinforcement before it becomes a hull failure. His second thought, arriving a half-second later, was that the shapes coming through the doorway were not human, and were not small, and were not here to make friends. They stood close to 7 feet, plated in dense, articulated armor the color of wet slate, and even without the armor Dale suspected they would have been imposing, corded muscle visible at the joints, skin a deep gray blue like something that had evolved under a colder, dimmer sun than Earth had ever known. Their heads were long, faces built with a jaw structure meant for tearing, not talking, though when the lead one spoke, the words came out precise and cold, filtered through a translator collar that made every syllable sound like it had been carved out of ice rather than said out loud. "Cargo master," the alien said, addressing the ship's captain, who had arrived pale and shaking with her hands half raised, her voice already cracking before she'd said a single word. "You will surrender manifest and crew registry. Resistance is inefficient." Dale stood in the doorway of the corridor, tool bag over one shoulder, and said nothing at first, because he had learned that in these situations, being the quiet guy in stained coveralls was armor of its own. Nobody pays attention to the man holding a wrench. Nobody, that is, until the wrench turns out to matter. It didn't hold, not entirely. The lead alien's eyes, pale, slitted, the color of old ice at the bottom of a glacier, swept over him anyway, cataloging and dismissing in the same glance, the way you'd glance at a chair before deciding it wasn't worth sitting in. "This one is unarmed," it said, not to Dale but to its companions, the way you might comment on furniture that happened to be standing in your path. "Frail, human labor cast, it will not resist." "You'd be surprised," Dale muttered mostly to himself, and one of the other aliens actually laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound, utterly without warmth, the laugh of something that had never once had a reason to doubt its own superiority. "Humans do not surprise the Kalvashi," it said. "You break the same way every time. Bone, then blood, then silence. We have seen it 1,000 times across 1,000 ships." "Bold talk from something that needed a cutting torch to get through a door," Dale said, and immediately regretted it, because the lead alien's head turned toward him with the slow, deliberate interest of a predator noticing prey had made an unexpected sound. "You will remain silent, small one," it said, "or you will be made silent. Either serves our purpose equally." That was when the captain, in a fit of either desperation or genuine stupidity, mentioned that the Harrow's debt was under escort contract to the Kalvashi's rival trade cartel, and that attacking it violated a treaty the Kalvashi crown itself had signed with considerable ceremony less than 2 years prior. It was, in retrospect, the worst possible thing she could have said, because it meant the boarding party's leader had to radio up the chain, and up the chain meant word reached someone who took treaty violations personally enough to come deal with it herself, in person, at considerable inconvenience, and in a mood that would not improve upon arrival. She arrived 40 minutes later on a shuttle sleek and dark as a knife, and she was, by any measure Dale could think of, extraordinary, tall even by Kalvashi standards, armor inlaid with pale gold that marked rank, movements with the coiled economy of someone who had never once in her life needed to hurry for anyone, and never would. Her name, translated clumsily by the collar tech, came out as something like Raske Van Sule, and the boarding crew immediately fell into a kind of stiff, formal silence around her that told Dale everything he needed to know about where she sat in whatever hierarchy these people answered to. The crew of the Harrow's debt, without anyone deciding to, just started calling her the princess, because that was apparently close enough to true, and because nobody on that ship wanted to try pronouncing her actual name twice. She looked at the hole in the hull, then at the trembling captain, then last at Dale, who had made the mistake of still being in the room, tool bag over his shoulder, looking like exactly what he was, a grease. Stay nobody in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is the vessel's defense, she said, and her mouth did something that on a human face would have been a smirk, sharp and entirely unkind. A laborer with a wrench. Your cartel sends children to negotiate treaty disputes now. It's a crimping tool, actually, Dale said, before he could stop himself, because apparently 38 years of professional discipline evaporated the instant someone insulted his toolkit specifically rather than him generally. The princess's slitted eyes narrowed with something that might have been amusement, might have been contempt, and on her this early, it was hard to tell the two apart. You will be the one who fights then, she said. It wasn't a question, and her tone made clear she didn't expect it to need to be one. Kelvashi law states a vessel accused of treaty violation may contest the claim through single combat, offered by whichever crew member volunteers. No other of your crew has volunteered. By forfeiture, you are volunteered. Dale looked around the room. The captain would not meet his eyes. The rest of the crew, pressed against the bulkheads, would not meet his eyes either, every single one of them suddenly fascinated by their own boots. Nobody would meet his eyes because meeting his eyes meant risking being volunteered themselves, and Dale understood that completely, and hated it only a little because he'd have done the same thing in their position. Once, a long time ago, before a fire and 40 sailors had taught him otherwise. And if I say no, he asked, already knowing the answer, asking mostly to have it confirmed out loud so there'd be no confusion later about who had offered him what choice. Then this vessel and its full crew are forfeit as spoils of an uncontested claim, the princess said flatly, like she was reading off a maintenance log rather than pronouncing a death sentence on 40-odd people. You may decline the duel. You may not decline the consequence. There it was. No door out of the room that didn't end somewhere ugly. Dale sighed, set down the tool bag with more care than the situation strictly called for, and started rolling up his sleeves, because apparently that was just going to be the shape of his afternoon now, on top of the coolant leak, on top of everything else. Fine, he said, rules. Single weapon of your choosing, the princess said. No armor, no aid. You fight until submission, unconsciousness, or death. Choose carefully, small one. It will not take long, and I have a fleet audit waiting for me that I would rather not delay further on your account. Dale went back to his bunk without another word and pulled a long case out from under it, one the crew had assumed for 2 years held spare parts, because that's what he'd told them, and because nobody ever looks twice at a mechanic's junk box. Inside, wrapped in old cloth older than some of the crew members, was a kinetic rifle, a genuine antique, chambered for solid slug ammunition, mechanically actuated, no power cell, no targeting computer, no energy signature at all. It had belonged to his grandfather, who had carried it through a war fought entirely with things that went bang instead of things that went hum, and Dale had rebuilt every working part of it himself, twice, out of stubbornness as much as sentiment, oiling the action by hand on quiet nights when sleep wouldn't come, and the past insisted on visiting anyway. When he walked back into the cargo bay carrying it, the princess actually laughed, a real laugh this time, sharp and delighted, the first unguarded thing he'd seen her do since she'd stepped off that shuttle. A relic, she said. Chemical propulsion. No shielding penetration rating whatsoever. You bring a museum piece to answer a treaty claim. I have seen children's training weapons with more stopping power than that thing. It's what I've got, Dale said, and meant it, and didn't bother explaining that what he had was usually enough, one way or another, given time. Class 5 personal shielding, the princess said, gesturing at the thin shimmer already forming around her own frame as a servant clipped a generator unit to her belt with practiced efficiency, has never been breached by Kinetic's small arms. Not once in the recorded history of the war. You would need a weapon 3 centuries beyond that thing to so much as scratch it. She tilted her head, almost gentle, almost pitying, the way you might look at a child insisting on carrying a stick into a storm. You may choose again. I will permit it out of, call it courtesy for a doomed thing. It costs me nothing to be generous with the dying. I'll keep the rifle, Dale said. As you wish, she said, and something in her voice suggested she'd already stopped thinking of this as a contest and started thinking of it as a formality, a box to be checked before the real business of the day could resume. Then let us not waste further time on sea. Rimani. The duel took place in the ship's largest open bay, cargo crates shoved to the walls, crew pressed against every available surface to watch, because there was nowhere else on a ship this size to be that didn't put you within earshot of what was about to happen anyway. Kelvashi nobility fought hand to hand in these contests as a matter of pride, trusting their shielding and their raw physical superiority to end things quickly. And the princess didn't draw a weapon at all, didn't so much as glance at one, the way a person doesn't reach for a hammer to swat a fly. She closed the distance in a blur that Dale's body reacted to before his mind caught up. Some old instinct from his naval days throwing him sideways half a second before her fist would have caved in his ribs, instead of just cracking two of them with a sound like green wood snapping. The blow that did land sent him skidding across the deck plating, breath punched clean out of his lungs, and the sound the crowd made was somewhere between a gasp and a groan, the sound of people watching something they already assumed was over before it had properly started. Dale got up anyway. That was the thing about him nobody in that bay understood yet. He had never once, in 38 years, learned how to stay down when there was still a reason to get up, and the reason today happened to be 40 other people's lives, which was, in his private ledger, about as good a reason as they came. He fired twice, both shots absorbed harmlessly by the pale shimmer of her shield, the rounds crumpling to slag against a barrier that didn't so much as flicker, twin flashes of useless white light that told him nothing he hadn't already expected. You see, the princess said, almost bored, circling him now unhurried, savoring the shape of an easy afternoon. There is no shame in this, only physics. Give me a minute, Dale said, breathing hard, blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten his own cheek on impact. I'm still doing the math. What the princess did not know, could not have known, because Kelvashi physiology didn't work this way and never had, was that the bay's environmental systems ran hot, deliberately, because Dale had rerouted a chunk of the heat exchange load through this section 3 shifts ago while doing unrelated maintenance and never gotten around to reversing it. It hadn't been sabotage. It had been laziness, honestly, the kind of thing you leave for later because nothing depended on it at the time. Except now, everything did, and Dale had realized as much the moment he'd stepped into that bay, and felt the familiar, oppressive warmth against his skin like an old friend, showing up uninvited but exactly on time. Kelvashi ran cold-blooded metabolisms optimized for their homeworld's dim, chill climate, evolved across 100,000 generations under a sun that barely warmed the ice fields they called home. Their armor, their shield generators, their bodies, none of it dissipated heat well, because none of it had ever needed to. Humans, on the other hand, were engineered by several 100,000 years of evolution to be walking radiators, built to run down prey across open savanna in heat that would kill almost anything else on 4 legs. simply by sweating and not stopping, hour after hour, until whatever they were chasing simply could not run anymore. It was, Dale had always privately thought, the single most underrated weapon his species had ever developed, and nobody outside a physiology textbook ever gave it a second thought. He noticed the princess's movement slowing almost imperceptibly across the next two exchanges. Not exhaustion exactly, heat stress. Her shield generator working harder to compensate for a body that was quietly, invisibly cooking inside armor built for a much colder war than the one currently being fought in an overheated cargo bay 11,000 light-years from her homeworld's ice fields. He didn't say any of that out loud. He just kept moving, kept circling, kept making her chase him instead of the other way around, letting the bay's furnace heat do slow, patient work that no punch of his ever could, sweat already soaking through his coveralls and running freely down his face, and every drop of it was doing more damage to her than any bullet he owned. "You dodge like prey," she said, contempt fraying slightly at the edges now, breath coming faster than before, a fact she clearly hadn't expected to notice about herself in this particular fight. "Funny you should mention prey," Dale said, and didn't explain, because explaining would have cost him breath he needed for running, and because some advantages work better kept quiet until it's too late to matter that the other side finally understands them. It cost him plenty, all of it. Her third solid hit dislocated his shoulder with a wet, grinding pop that whited out his vision for a full second. He shoved it back into the socket himself against a support strut, biting down on a scream until it came out as a strangled grunt instead, because screaming wasted air, and air was the only resource he had left that she couldn't just take from him with her fists. His left eye was swelling shut, the skin around it already going tight and hot. 2 ribs, cracked earlier, had progressed to something worse. Every breath now came with a grinding stitch of pain that told him, professionally, clinically, in the same flat voice he used to diagnose a failing engine, that one of them had probably punctured something it shouldn't have. He was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow that kept sheeting blood down into his good eye, and he kept wiping it away with a forearm that was shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline in roughly equal measure, smearing more than he cleared. He kept moving anyway. He kept firing anyway, useless slug after useless slug spanging off her shield in flashes of harmless white light, not because he expected any one shot to do anything, but because every shot she absorbed was heat her generator had to bleed off. Heat that had nowhere efficient to go in a bay that Dale had, entirely by accident, turned into an oven 3 shifts before anyone had even known there'd be a fight in it. "Why do you not fall?" the princess said, and for the first time there was something under the contempt that wasn't quite contempt anymore. Something closer to a genuine question, asked the way you'd ask about a machine doing something its specifications insisted it couldn't. "Over time," Dale rasped, spitting blood onto the deck. "Company doesn't pay me enough to lose fights for free, and frankly, neither do you." Her fourth strike, aimed to end it, missed by the width of a knuckle because his legs, running purely on stubborn muscle memory at this point, buckled at exactly the wrong moment for her and exactly the right one for him, and her fist met the support strut instead of his skull, denting reinforced alloy with a crack that echoed through the whole bay like a gunshot of its own. She staggered back half a step, just half a step. But Dale saw it, and more importantly, so did every Kelvashi soldier watching from the edges of the room, because half a step was not a thing that happened to Kelvashi nobility in single combat against unarmored labor caste, not in living memory. Not according to any of the old songs they'd grown up hearing about their own people's certain, permanent superiority. The princess straightened, breathing harder now, visibly, her shield shimmer flickering at the edges from thermal load it had never been designed to handle in a fight this long, this hot, this stubborn. She looked at Dale bleeding, favoring one side, standing on legs that clearly did not want to hold him up anymore, one eye swollen nearly shut, and something shifted behind her pale eyes, some old certainty cracking just slightly at the edges the way ice cracks before it finally, all at once, gives way. "You should be unconscious," she said, quietly now, almost to herself, almost like an accusation. "Working on it," Dale said. "Give me another minute. I'm slower than I used to be." She didn't attack again immediately. She circled, wary now in a way she hadn't been at the start, watching him with the focused attention you give something you've stopped being certain you understand, recalculating an equation she'd assumed was settled before she'd even walked into the room. That was the moment the calm in the bay crackled to life with a voice that was not Dale's captain, not the princess's guard, but a Kalvashi officer patched through from the shuttle in a tone that cut straight through the tension of the duel like a blade through wet paper, urgent in a way Kalvashi voices almost never allowed themselves to sound. "Highness," the voice said, "long-range sensors have picked up a fleet signature entering the system, unregistered. Signature pattern matches the Thren Combine." The princess's head snapped toward the comm, and for the first time since she'd walked into that bay, Dale watched real fear cross a Kalvashi face. Not for herself, he'd learn later, but for what a Thren Combine fleet arriving during an active Kalvashi treaty dispute actually meant for the fragile political balance she was supposed to be quietly maintaining out here on the edge of contested space. The Combine had been waiting a generation for exactly this kind of opening, proof that the Kalvashi crown was overextended, distracted, vulnerable at its edges, tangled up in some pointless dispute over a rusted cargo hauler while its enemies circled closer. "How many ships?" the princess said, and her voice had lost every trace of the boredom it had carried a minute earlier. 12 capital class," the voice answered. "ETA weapons range under 9 minutes, Highness." "And our escort?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told its own story before anyone said a word. "Recalled 3 days ago, Highness. Rias. Ein to the border dispute at Threll's Reach. We were told this sector was considered secure." The princess's jaw tightened, and Dale, even bleeding and half-blind in one eye, caught the flicker of something ugly crossing her face. Not surprise exactly, but the particular anger of someone realizing they'd been quietly, deliberately set up by someone within their own chain of command who wanted her caught exactly here, exactly now, undefended and distracted, when word of a Combine incursion reached the crown. Somebody back home had wanted this dispute to run long. Somebody had wanted her stuck out here answering treaty grievances, while the escort that should have been guarding this sector got pulled somewhere else entirely on paperwork that would, Dale suspected, turn out to have a very convenient signature on it once anyone bothered to look. The duel, suddenly, was the smallest problem in the room, and everybody in that bay understood it in the same instant. The princess turned back to Dale, and something in her posture had changed entirely. Not submission, not yet, but recalculation, fast and total, the look of someone realizing the rules of the game had just been rewritten by someone with far bigger guns and, worse, by someone wearing her own crown's uniform. "This vessel's defense grid is obsolete," she said, "and my own shuttle carries no weapons capable of engaging capital ships. Your ship's registry lists a defense contract with a cartel with no fleet presence in this system. We are, both of us, about to die for reasons that have nothing to do with this duel, and I suspect someone arranged matters that way quite deliberately." "So we call it a draw," Dale said, blood still dripping steadily off his chin, "and go work on the actual problem." The princess studied him for one more long second. This bleeding, broken, absurdly stubborn human who had refused to stay down through 4 blows that should have ended him 3 times over, who had somehow, through nothing but sweat and persistence and a bit of accidental engineering, made a Kalvashi noble stagger in single combat for the first time any of her soldiers had ever witnessed. And then slowly, deliberately, in front of her own soldiers, she knelt. Just slightly. Just enough. A Kalvashi noble did not kneel to labor caste under any circumstance the old laws recognized, and she did it anyway, right there on the scorched deck plating, and set her closed fist against her own chest in a gesture Dale didn't recognize, but understood instantly anyway. The way you understand a salute in any language the first time you see it offered sincerely. "You have earned the right to fight beside me instead of against me," she said. "Later, if there is a later, I will decide what to call what just happened here. For now, mechanic, what can that ship of yours actually do?" Dale didn't answer right away. He was doing the math, the same kind of math he'd been running his whole life without anyone ever noticing he was running it. Not tactics exactly, but systems. Every ship was a body, and every body had weaknesses that had nothing to do with size, the same way a battleship's engine room could be brought down by a single stuck valve if you knew exactly where to look. "The Harrow's debt has no weapons worth mentioning," he said, pressing a rag someone had handed him against the cut over his eye, wincing as it touched raw skin. "But she's got a heat exchange system I've been quietly overloading for the last 3 shifts, which is currently why your shield generator's been struggling this whole fight, in case you were wondering about that. And she's got a cargo bay full of unshielded ferrous freight containers, 600 tons of raw refined, or we were hauling to a smelting station before your people showed up and interrupted my day." "None of that stops 12 capital ships," the princess said. "No," Dale agreed. "But their shields have to be tuned to something, right? Same as yours. Every energy shield runs a modulation cycle to stop resonance buildup. It's why your shield flickered every time I hit it in the exact same spot instead of holding rock steady the whole fight. Yours is a small personal unit. Capital ship shields run the same principle at scale, just with wider modulation gaps because they're covering more surface area and generating a lot more waste heat of their own that has to go somewhere." He wiped blood off his mouth with the back of a shaking hand. "If I know their modulation frequency, and Thren Combine hardware isn't exactly a state secret, I've serviced captured units before, back on contracts nobody bothered checking my references for. I can time a shot to hit during the null point in the cycle, the half-second where the shield's phased out to prevent it cooking its own hull from the inside." "With what weapon?" the princess said, glancing at the antique still clutched in his hand. "That rifle could not so much as mark my own shield at full charge, and my shield is a fraction the size and power of a capital ship's." "Your shield's a fraction the size of a capital ship's hull plating," Dale said. "A slug that can't dent Class-5 up close can absolutely put a hole clean through unshielded hull plating a kilometer out if it arrives during the exact half-second the shield isn't there to stop it. It's not about power. It's never been about power. It's about timing." He managed something that on his ruined face passed for a grin, blood still tacky along his jaw. "This gun doesn't run on a power cell. No energy signature, no targeting emission, nothing their sensors are built to flag as a threat. To them, right up until it's already through the hull, it'll register as debris, drifting scrap, nothing worth a second look." The princess looked at him for a long moment, then at the antique rifle in his shaking hands, and something in her expression shifted from disbelief towards something that looked almost like respect trying to find a place to land after a lifetime of never having needed to make room for it. "Then you had better be very, very good at your math, mechanic," she said. "Because we have approximately 8 minutes left to prove it, and I would very much like to still be alive to discuss the finer points of your engineering afterward." What followed was not glamorous. It was cables and calculations, not speeches. Dale, one arm strapped tight against his ribs by a crewmate with medical training and a face full of worry, worked the Harrow's debt's ancient targeting array with hands that wouldn't stop shaking from adrenaline crash, cross-referencing shield modulation data the princess's own tactical officer fed him from her shuttle's databanks over a hastily patched comm line. "Thren Combine Capital Shields cycle at 41 Hz, the tactical officer reported, voice tight over the comm, clearly unused to taking direction from anyone outside her own chain of command, let alone a human mechanic with blood still drying on his collar. Null window duration, 0.06 seconds. That's nothing, someone on Dale's crew muttered, watching him work. That's plenty, Dale said, not looking up from the manual firing solution he was building by hand on a targeting scope older than most of the people watching him use it, scratching numbers onto a scrap of hull panel because the ship's own computer was too slow and too automated to trust with something this precise. This rifle's got a mechanical trigger. No electronic lag, no processing delay, nothing for their systems to detect coming. I pull, the firing pin drops, the round's gone, full stop. 0.06 seconds is an eternity for a machine with no brain to wait for, and it's plenty for a man who's spent his whole life learning to read a rhythm before it happens. He rigged the cargo bay's loading rail, the same mechanism that normally hauled ore containers into position, as an improvised firing platform, bolting the rifle to a length of structural strut scavenged from a bulkhead panel, angling it out through the still-glowing boarding breach in the hull, because it was, conveniently, already a hole pointed roughly the right direction, a small, ugly joke of circumstance that Dale intended to make full use of. "You're aiming a museum piece through a hole a boarding party cut in my hull," the captain said, somewhere between awe and horror, watching him work. "Man makes do with the tools he's got," Dale said, and kept working, checking the mounting bolts twice, then a third time because a rifle that shifted half a millimeter at this range would miss by kilometers, and there would be no second shot to correct with. The Thren Combine fleet dropped out of transit exactly where the sensors predicted, 12 dark, angular capital ships arranging themselves with the unhurried menace of something that had never once lost a fight it started and didn't expect to start losing today. Their lead vessel opened a channel, and a voice came through cold and satisfied, already savoring a victory it assumed was inevitable, the particular smugness of an ambush that thinks it's found easy prey. "Kelvashi Princess," it said, "your presence here undefended is a fortunate accident for the Combine. Surrender your shuttle and your claim to this sector, or we will remove both by force, and I confess I would prefer the latter." The princess, standing now beside Dale in the cargo bay rather than above him, keyed the comm with a calm that Dale suspected was mostly performance at this point, her shield generator still faintly warm against her hip from the duel not 10 minutes prior. "You assume I am undefended," she said, and cut the channel before the lead ship could answer, before it could ask the obvious follow-up question that would have unraveled the whole bluff in a single sentence. "That's your one good bluff," Dale said quietly, eye on the targeting scope. "Now we need it to be true or close enough T. Oh, true that they don't call it before we get one shot off." He'd run the numbers 4 times already, checking against the tactical officer's modulation data, checking against his own memory of Combine shield hardware from a decade of half-legal repair contracts out on stations that didn't ask too many questions about where a mechanic had learned to service military-grade shielding, checking against pure gut instinct that told him where the lead ship's command deck sat behind its hull plating, even without a proper schematic to confirm it. Just the shape of the hull and a lifetime spent reading ships the way other people read faces. The null window came every 0.024 seconds of the 41 Hz cycle. That was his one, single moment, over and over, and he only needed to land inside it once cleanly, with nothing left over for a second attempt. "Range check," he said. 800 meters and closing, the tactical officer reported, voice tighter now, watching 12 capital ships crawl toward weapons range on a display that made the Harrow's debt look like a child's toy floating in front of them. "Good," Dale said. "Close is good. Fewer variables. Less time for the round to drift off the line I'm giving it." He sighted down the ancient scope, breathing through the grinding pain in his ribs, blood still tacky along his jaw, one eye swollen half shut, and waited for a rhythm that no instrument on that bridge could see but that he could feel, the same way he'd felt a coolant line about to blow before the gauge ever admitted it, the same way he'd known, once on another ship entirely, exactly which valve to close, and exactly how many seconds he had to do it in before it stopped mattering whether he was right. Steady, he murmured to himself, or maybe to the rifle, or maybe to his own grandfather, wherever that old man's memory lived now. Steady. The lead ship's forward hull, right where the command deck sat, shimmered faint and pale under Class-5 capital shielding, a curtain of light that had never once in recorded history failed to stop a kinetic round, that every weapons officer in this fleet had been trained since childhood to consider absolute. Dale fired. The round left the barrel at a velocity that would have looked laughably slow to any Kelvashi weapons officer trained on energy lances and plasma cannons. A single dumb lump of solid metal following nothing but the plain, patient laws of ballistics through open vacuum. Unhurried, unremarkable, exactly the kind of thing no sensor array in the galaxy had ever been told to worry about. It arrived at the lead ship's hull exactly 0.06 seconds into the shield's modulation cycle. In the null window Dale had bet everything on. A half-second gap the ship's own systems opened deliberately every 41 Hz to keep the shield generator from overheating itself into slag under its own power. There was nothing there to stop it. Nothing at all, just bare hull plating that had never once needed to defend itself against anything moving this slowly, this quietly, this completely beneath notice. The slug punched clean through unshielded hull plating with a spray of superheated metal and decompressing atmosphere, tearing through decks never designed to be struck by anything, because nothing in the galaxy's current weapons doctrine bothered designing armor against slow metal from a gun with no power cell. It didn't need to be a killing blow. It needed to be a believable one, arriving from a direction and a method their sensors had logged half a second earlier as harmless drifting debris. Nothing worth flagging, nothing worth a second look until it was already 3 decks deep and venting atmosphere into vacuum. The lead ship's command deck depressurized in seconds. Emergency klaxons Dale couldn't hear, but could imagine perfectly lit up on every display across that bridge, red lights spinning over a crew that had a lot of very difficult questions to answer and no good way to answer any of them. And every other ship in that formation, watching their flagship take a hit that should have been physically impossible against Class-5 shielding, did exactly what any sane fleet does when the laws of physics apparently stop applying the way they'd been told. They hesitated, engines flaring as 11 capital ships slowed their approach at once, sensors screaming at their crews to identify a threat nobody could actually locate. "Now," the princess said into her own calm, voice suddenly hard and commanding in a way Dale hadn't heard from her yet, every trace of the earlier boredom burned away entirely. "Signal the relay buoy. Tell Fleet Command the Combine struck first, unprovoked, against a treaty escort. Tell them exactly what they need to hear to come running, and tell them I want to know precisely who reassigned my escort 3 days ago, because I do not believe for one moment that was an accident of scheduling." It wasn't strength that ended the standoff. It was the 11 remaining Combine ships realizing, in the space of about 90 seconds, that a supposedly undefended treaty vessel had just put a hole through their flagship's command deck with a weapon their sensors hadn't even registered as a weapon, which meant, from their perspective, that this undefended ship had capabilities they didn't understand, in a system where Kelvashi reinforcements might already be inbound, summoned by a relay signal none of them could intercept in time to stop. Nobody wanted to be the second ship to find out the hard way what else that vessel could do, and nobody wanted to be the officer who explained to their own high command why they'd pressed an attack against an unknown weapon system, with no idea how it worked or how many more shots it had left in it. The Combine fleet broke formation and withdrew into transit within 4 minutes, faster than any dignified retreat, leaving their crippled flagship drifting and its escort ships too shaken to press an advantage they no longer trusted existed. It wasn't a victory in the sense the history books would later clean it up into. It was a bluff, built entirely on one true shot and 11 ships worth of doubt, and it worked exactly as well as it needed to, which was, in Dale's professional opinion, the only kind of victory that ever really mattered anyway. In the cargo bay, Dale set the rifle down with hands that had finally, mercifully, stopped shaking, and sat heavily on an ore crate, because his legs had apparently decided the emergency was over and it was fine to stop working now. Thank you very much, and not 1 second sooner. Someone get the medic, he said to nobody to everyone. And also, genuinely, whoever's cooking on this ship, I want actual food, not ration paste. I earned real food today and I intend to collect. The princess crossed the bay to where he sat, and this time when she knelt, there was no calculation left in it at all, just a straightforward, deliberate gesture. One hand pressed flat over her own heart, head bowed for a full 3 seconds in front of her own soldiers, in front of Dale's crew, in front of anyone watching who cared to remember it later. You broke a rule of physics I have believed since I was a child, she said. A weapon with no shielding penetration whatsoever, defeating Class 5 shielding not through power, but through patience and mathematics. She looked up at him, and whatever contempt had lived behind those pale eyes at the start of this day was entirely gone now, replaced by something Dale suspected was rarer from her than the contempt had ever been, and worth considerably more. The Kalvashi crown does not forget a debt like this one. You have my name, mechanic, and you have my word, and among my people that is worth considerably more than either. Great, Dale said, wincing as the ship's medic finally arrived and started assessing the full, ugly inventory of his injuries with a clicking tongue, and a face that suggested this was going to take a while. Put it in writing. I've got 2 cracked ribs, one of them possibly worse than that, a shoulder that's going to hate me for a month, and a boarding party-sized hole in my hull that somebody's going to have to pay for. On top of the coolant leak, your people's little visit distracted me from finishing properly. The Kalvashi crown will cover the repair costs, the princess said, with the faintest ghost of what might, on a human face, have been a smile. All of them, including whatever your grandfather's rifle requires to be restored to full working order. I suspect it has earned the attention. Good, Dale said. Then we're square. Now somebody help me up, because I am not doing that again today, and if your fleet command wants a longer conversation about all this, they can have it after I've eaten something that didn't come out of a foil packet. Word of what happened aboard the Harrow's debt spread through the sector faster than any official report could, the way stories about impossible things always do. The alien princess who knelt to a human mechanic, the antique rifle that punched a hole through shielding no weapon of its era should have been able to touch, the fleet of 12 that turned tail and ran from a ship with no working weapons at all. Somewhere back at the Kalvashi court, an investigation quietly opened into exactly who had reassigned a sector escort 3 days before a Combine incursion. Nobody outside a very small circle should have known was coming. And Dale heard, much later, secondhand, that the officer responsible had not enjoyed the conversation that followed nearly as much as he'd enjoyed arranging the ambush in the first place. Dale didn't much care for the attention. What he cared about was that the Harrow's debt got its hull patched at Kalvashi Crown expense, that his contract got quietly, permanently upgraded to something with actual hazard pay attached, and that the rifle, his grandfather's rifle, chambered for slugs, running on nothing but chemistry and stubbornness, went back into its case under his bunk, wrapped in the same old cloth as always, because as far as he was concerned it had done its job and earned a rest same as he had. When a young crewmate asked him, weeks later, how it had felt to become a legend in a single afternoon, Dale just shrugged, one shoulder still stiff from where it had popped out of socket, and said the only thing that felt honest. Felt like a long shift, he said, and I still didn't get paid enough for it. If you liked watching an old kinetic rifle outthink 12 capital ships more than it outshot them, go ahead and hit like. Subscribe if you want more stories where humans win with sweat and stubbornness instead of muscle. And drop a comment telling me what you think Dale's grandfather would have said if he could have seen that rifle in action one more time. And share this one with somebody who still believes the old tools are useless. They might be surprised.